Hi, everyone. This is John Daly. I'm here with my co host Thomas D. House for another episode of the Reagan Caucus podcast. Our guest today is a firearms reporter for thereload.com, which he founded. It is an excellent source of information on gun related stories, gun laws, and the politics surrounding firearms. He's also a gun safety instructor and a former CNN contributor. I'm talking about Stephen Gutowski. Stephen, thanks for joining the two of us today on the Reagan Caucus podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, it's great having you on. You are an expert on firearms, and I'll start again. We originally invited you on the podcast a little over a week ago to talk about President Trump's DC crime crackdown and what it meant for gun owners. I still want to get to that, but we are recording this episode on Friday, August 29th, just 2 days removed from that terrible, I would say, evil shooting at a Catholic school in Minnesota. The numbers could change by the time this episode airs, but as of now, according to the reporting, 2 children were killed and 18 others, 15 of them children, were injured. The shooter, a 23-year-old, later died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Stephen, you have been sort of a go-to person at times like these, not just because, of your wealth of knowledge on firearms, gun laws, gun statistics, but I think also because you treat these stories, and there's unfortunately been a number of them, with real care, with facts and nuance, and I think a real understanding too of the emotions that surround this moment. I feel like that's very admirable. I feel like that approach is really lacking in many corridors. Many political leaders and media figures tend to go right for the low-hanging fruit in these situations and end up distorting a number of things. Sometimes I think it's sort of a genuine lack of knowledge or just raw emotion. Other times I think politics are certainly at play. Stephen, is this kind of why the Reload and your reporting exists, to really cut through the misinformation in a thoughtful, constructive way that may actually help with the discourse and maybe even help address some of these problems?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a big part of why I founded the Reload is just this gap in understanding out there between like major media outlets, which tend to not have a focus on gun reporting outside of mass shootings, and that can often lead to a lack of knowledge on the topic, which leads to like mistakes that we see pretty commonly in major media reporting on guns. So that major media doesn't know a lot about firearms, how they work, or the culture around them. And then at the same time, gun media, like there's strong gun media in this country, right? And they know a lot more about firearms and the gun owning culture and things of that nature, but much less about politics and how Capitol Hill works and that. And so you get a lot of you'll get a lot of conspiracy reporting in gun media, or a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation about how things work on Capitol Hill or in state houses, and so the Reload tries to fill that gap. We're knowledgeable about firearms, and we're knowledgeable about um, the politics of guns and how Capitol Hill works. And so, additionally, when it comes to things like mass shootings, we try to take a sober, serious approach to everything we do, and we focus on hard news and analysis over opinion. That's another thing that's very, very common when discussing guns, as you alluded to. There's just a lot of opinion first coverage, sort of regardless of whether you're talking about major media or gun media. And we try to do things differently by focusing on reporting facts and doing a more dispassionate analysis. But that doesn't mean we don't have empathy for these sorts of horrible situations that are going on, and we've done a lot of reporting on the research into mass shootings in particular. It's one of the most common topics, obviously, and understandably so to a certain extent, right? I mean, these are horrible things that everybody wants to see prevented or stopped. And we've done a number of podcasts as well with leading researchers on mass shootings that cut through a lot of the partisan discussion that tends to occur around these sorts of events. It's either the focus on wanting new gun restrictions as the only solution, or on the other side, wanting to focus on blaming mental illness or school security issues. And not that any of those things are should be considered off the table as far as discussion goes on these, or coverage topics goes. But if you talk to the mass shooting researchers, the people who've studied this phenomenon, what you'll find is, I think, a lot more agreement around the causes and potential solutions for these acts that are much less partisanly charged. It's not necessarily, for instance, the Violence Project is one that I've read extensively as a book, and then several researchers who run a nonprofit that focuses on mass shootings. And, they talk about these mass shootings and this Annunciation Catholic school shooting. I think the shooter there fits this profile very succinctly. I mean, there's been a lot of focus in partisan media on either the fact that they were trans, or and wrote some anti-Trump messages on their firearms or and magazines, and then on the other side, I've seen focus on the racist messages that they wrote, or some of the other messages that they sent that would conflict with the anti-Trump messaging, right? And that's not uncommon to see with these shooters. You read their manifestos, or you listen to their ramblings. They're often incoherent, and they often take varied positions that don't line up with one political stripe or another in any substantial, like solid way. They're often mixed. For instance, the Buffalo shooter obviously had racist motivations to carry out his attack, but if you read his writings, he also had like eco-terror leanings as well. Like, these people don't necessarily hold a coherent ideology, many of these mass shooters, but they do follow this certain playbook, right? The fact that, to me, what's more important than what was in the manifesto for the Buffalo shooter or the Annunciation shooter is that they left a manifesto, that they did that act because it's part of this what's called social proofing. It's part of this playbook that mass shooters have followed for years, because we have a certain idea of what a school shooter or mass shooter is, and that, to the point where everybody would know what I meant if I said that person they're giving school shooter, right? And the school shooters have this understanding too, that, oh, I'm like these people, and therefore I should do, or what I can do, or what are the things that's a solution to my mental health spiral, which is different from mental illness, right? These people are going through a mental health spiral. That's what the Violence Project research shows. It's not so much that they have necessarily a mental health, a mental illness, a diagnosable mental illness. It's that it's similar to a suicidal spiral, where they'll spiral down into this point, and then at the lowest point, they'll think, okay, I recognize myself in these other attackers, and one of the things that's expected to do for those people to do is carry out an attack like this, even if they know it's wrong. This person is another example. They said they knew people would hate them for doing this. They knew that it was wrong to do. They'd spiraled down into considering it several times before, didn't carry it out, and then finally did. And so there's ways to address that are outside of what we tend to talk about most, right? So off-ramping is what the Violence Project calls it, for instance, where you try to you identify the signs that somebody is going through this specific kind of mental health spiral where they could commit violence against either themselves or others, or both in many cases. And you try to provide them with off-ramps to avoid carrying out the actual attack. So that's been a big part of our coverage as well, is sort of trying to take a more serious approach to understanding this terrible phenomenon that happens in America that has been over the last 30 years extremely polarized and politicized, and looking for maybe some new angles to it that offer, I think, a bit more hope to actually get to solutions.
Yeah, that's exactly the sort of nuance, and that was a really good, that was some really good information because I was going to ask you about that. It seems that the one broad belief that every side of the gun debate, has sort of agreed on is that, severely mentally ill people shouldn't have access to firearms. You talk about this mental spiral, which is different, and that kind of goes
Yeah.
to that, this is not an easy thing, to understand, and I'm glad there's work that's going into it. We hear a lot of talk about in recent years. A lot of people have brought up red flag laws. States have them. I don't think that most. I don't know if most or if all states. I don't think all states have them. But
Not
can
all.
you explain for people who aren't familiar with what those are? What are red flag laws, and are they triggered that often? Or triggered is probably not a great word. Are they apply that often? Did you know if, as far as statistics go, where people are actually reaching out to law enforcement and saying, this family member, I'm worried about them?
Yeah, that's a good question. And this is red flag laws are interesting because they are, at least initially, were part of that sort of attempt in the wake of Parkland to find maybe a new initiative to focus on, because a lot of the focus before that was on assault weapons bans, universal background checks, or things that come up for the last 30 to 40 years in the gun debate, and generally gun debate happens around mass shootings, right? Whereas red flag laws were kind of a new thought. They weren't brand new after Parkland, but they got a lot more attention because of for the reasons that you described there. Which red flag laws try to strike a sort of balance between the concerns that people have when it comes to gun legislation, right? You want to Most people would agree that you don't want somebody who's going through this kind of mental health spiral, who is potentially a threat to themselves or others, to have a firearm, right? So that that they could carry out an attack like this. However, a lot of people obviously also hold gun rights to be constitutionally protected by the Second Amendment, and to be even, guaranteed by their creator, right? That sort of flows from more than just the government, right? And so how do you balance that? Well, one solution was this temporary confiscation and that's what red flag orders are. That if somebody suspects that you are a threat to yourself or others, if you have a red flag law, and there's variations on this, for instance, like who can start the process to get a red flag order against you, they can take the concerns to a judge, and a judge can order that your guns be confiscated temporarily. So it's a temporary order during the duration of, usually they last for up to a year. And so it addressed some of the concerns right here, because federal law requires that anyone who's been adjudicated mentally ill as a threat to themselves or others, or involuntarily committed, has to be barred from owning guns. They can't possess firearms, but that bar is fairly high. That's something that covers all 50 states, right? That's pre-existing red flag laws, but it's the process to involuntarily commit somebody is a much more significant process. It's not something that's easy to do, understandably and correctly so, right? Because you're talking about essentially, restricting someone's movements. But that's where the red flag laws try to fill the gap between permanent disarmament and mental health commitment, and a temporary measure that keeps someone away from owning firearms while they deal with a mental health crisis. Of course, these also raise civil liberty questions as well. That's the main opposition now. It has kind of calcified more into a partisan breakdown, where mostly you see red flag laws in blue states and not in red states. There's some exceptions. Florida, for instance, after Parkland passed a red flag law, and then some more purpley states like Virginia has a red flag law. But Yeah, as far as their effectiveness goes, honestly, they are much more commonly used uh, in instances where somebody is suicidal. That's the vast
Oh,
majority of the actual red flag laws that you'll see, or red flag orders that you'll see issued. Are now there is, as the Violence Project talks about, there's a connection between um, people in suicidal states and people in a state where they might carry out a mass shooting. It's a similar kind of mental health crisis, not identical, certainly, and not everybody who is suicidal is. In fact, the vast majority of people who are suicidal or mentally ill are not a threat to other people. Um, but the mental health crisis is similar, and so that's where red flag laws kind of are brought up as a potential solution. With, well, some of the signs that somebody is might carry out a mass shooting are similar to some of the signs that they might take their own life. And so, in theory, a red flag order could have an effect. Now, we've seen a number of a lot of mass shootings where there were red flags and the states had red flag laws. In fact, this Minnesota has a red flag law, where the big problem you have, honestly, whether it's with red flag laws or a more permanent involuntary commitment, is that you need somebody to actually initiate that process. And if nobody is recognizing the flags in the person, close to them, or maybe they don't want to, that's a hard thing to try to have to admit to yourself, right? That your loved one may be considering carrying out, a horrific attack like the one we saw at the Catholic school this week. But if nobody does anything about it, or even in cases like Parkland or Sutherland Springs, where people did something but they didn't follow through on the additional steps to have the person involuntarily committed, or have their records properly shared with the authorities that would make them a prohibited person, prohibited from owning guns, then that's how you can have these incidents happen. I mean, this is another case where the shooter here bought guns legally because they just didn't have a disqualifying criminal or mental health record.
right. Well, I want to go ahead and bring Thomas into the conversation. Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think here. I like the way the tone of this conversation because it helps us to get clear thinking about this. Um, you said that there are these people that have focused on mass shootings and the issue of mass shootings. I'm sure not all of them are policy experts, but are there any policies that that many of those that the people who have done this research believe might be somewhat effective? Putting it to one side, the debates that people have about the trade-offs between the individual liberties and the regulations. Just asking a question about effectiveness. Are there any policies that they think would be very effective?
Yeah, I mean, the Violence Project. I mean, first off, a lot of the researchers will wade into gun control regulation as
Mhm.
well, and be supportive of some new restrictions, or at least talk about how the wide availability of firearms has an impact
Mhm.
in America on these things. But when you get to stuff beyond the typical debate over, gun restrictions, what you'll see is recommendations that center more around, I mean, honestly, just greater mental health support generally, especially in schools, is kind of I think the major component of this. The Violence Project talks about funding more mental health resources for in schools and also in communities, which was part of which can be political in and of itself as well. That was part of the 2022 Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Did do a lot of that in terms of funding mental health um, providers, especially in schools. And that has been something I think that the Trump administration has tried to withhold grants for, or cut back spending on. So even that can be sort of political in a certain sense, although you certainly see a lot of Republican support for the idea that mass shootings are a mental health issue at their core and should be addressed on that front. I think even the First Lady came out and was tweeting about it this week, Melania Trump. So there's not as much calcification, I think, in that political fight around mental health resources to prevent mass shootings, and especially school shootings. Because obviously schools are an environment where you can have direct access to the students and provide them with mental health care directly. It's easier to do that in school than perhaps just just in the community generally. But yeah, that is where you'll see a lot of discussion where it's like kind of just the general tactics for improving community mental health are things that will, in theory at least, help with the mass shooting issue. Now there are specific, techniques that they recommend for identifying people who are susceptible to this mental health spiral. There are specific red flags for that. Again, a lot of them overlap with somebody going through having suicidal ideation, but there are some specifics there as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, it seems to me, now tell me if I'm wrong here, it seems to me that any of the efforts that the regulation as far as like very dangerous weapons, like the banning of bump stocks, because they can make it easier to fire more rounds quickly, right? Or obviously the ban, we already have regulations for automatic weapons, because automatic weapons can spray very quickly and kill a lot of people in a short amount of time, right? Whereas like an assault weapon, what they call an assault rifle, it's a sort of political term, but what they call an assault rifle is actually a semi-automatic weapon. So you have to pull the trigger for each round, right? Is that right? So
yeah.
so
Well,
there's a huge line in safety between a semi-automatic and an automatic, right? Or the issue of the bump stocks, right, as being an issue of being able to, but that all, it seems to me that wouldn't stop mass shootings. That would reduce the number of casualties in a mass shooting. Is that right? Or
yeah, I guess that's the idea that you'll hear. I mean, this is where there's a lot of confusion, and this is what goes back to when I was talking about like major media doesn't have a strong understanding of this stuff and does a poor job of communicating, even on the most basic concepts with firearms and how they work. So yeah, like the assault rifle, assault weapon is can be very confusing, because assault rifle is, and this is maybe a little bit technical here, but assault rifles are a class of firearms that derive from a German gun from World War II called the Sturmgewehr, which literally translates to assault rifle or storm rifle. And that the capabilities of that firearm sort of define the class, which is they have to be capable of what's called select fire, which is where using a selector, you can either fire in fully automatic or semi-automatic modes. Fully automatic is when you pull the trigger once and the gun will continually fire rounds until you let go or run out of ammunition. So machine guns, that's what a machine gun is, fully automatic. Semi-automatic, as you mentioned there, is when you pull the trigger once, it fires once. And you have to pull the trigger every time you want to fire a new round. And there is a distinction in federal gun law that's existed since the 1930s between where we make it much more difficult to own the fully automatic firearms, Tommy guns or Rambo's machine gun, those sorts of things. The fully automatic stuff is heavily regulated under the National Firearms Act, and in fact has been banned. New sales of them have been banned to civilians in America since 1986. So you can buy the older ones, but it's very expensive and difficult to do. Whereas semi-automatic, the one shot for every trigger pull, those are common. That's the most common type of gun in the United States. And so, yes, now bump stocks are another thing in of themselves, made famous by the Las Vegas shooting, because they are devices that you attach to a semi-automatic firearm that allows you to pull that trigger much faster than you would normally be able to. And so it sort of mimics or gets closer to fully automatic rate of fire, how fast you can fire rounds, but it technically doesn't actually make the gun into a fully automatic on the mechanism side. And that was a key component of the bump stock ban that President Trump had instituted in his first term, and that the Supreme Court had thrown out as unconstitutional for basically the reasons there. It doesn't actually change the mechanism of the gun itself. But yes, as far as why we have those distinctions, why fully automatic weapons are banned, it goes back to the gangland era, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, Machine Gun Kelly. That stuff is where those restrictions come from, and it is essentially based on the idea that that you laid out there, which is fully automatic weapons are more dangerous, and that was the argument at the time. But look, guns are dangerous; they're lethal, and so semi-automatic firearms or something like, for instance, in this case, the most recent case, this shooter used 3 different kinds of guns. They used an AR-15 style rifle, the semi-automatic rifle that is covered by in that debate that we often get into around that's more what. So that you have assault rifle, which is this actual mechanical category, and then you have assault weapon, which is a more political statutory term that generally applies only to semi-automatic guns that fire a certain kind of ammunition, center fire, and have certain features like a flash suppressor or a pistol grip, and that are mainly cosmetic or ergonomic. They don't really affect the way the gun functions, if that makes sense. But they look very similar to military. So like an AR-15, I have an AR-15 behind me here. It looks like an M4 from the military, which is that assault rifle. It has that capability of doing an automatic fire. The one I have, and the one most civilians have, only does semi-automatic, but they are the same platform, they're the same internals, except for that fact that the civilian version can't do the fully automatic fire. So hopefully that clears up some things here.
It's my understanding that if you say there are all these sort of debated weapons in the middle of like the more dangerous semi-automatic weapons that are actually being debated, if you get rid of those, you're not going to get rid of mass shootings. You might reduce the number of deaths in a mass shooting. Isn't that correct?
That's the argument, right? That the argument for assault weapons bans or magazine restrictions is another one, where most AR-15s or even just modern pistols like a Glock or Smith & Wesson M&P line, they come with magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. And ARs will come with 30-round magazines. Most handguns, full-size handguns, will come with like 17-round magazines. And a lot of states, more blue states, have restricted both AR-15s themselves and then also the magazine capacity down to like 10 rounds. The argument being, well, that'll make it harder for mass shooters to kill as many people in a quick period of time. That's the argument. Now the thing is, we of course have seen a lot of mass shootings where that didn't necessarily play out. You will still see, for instance, the Santa Fe high school shooting. That shooter used a pump action shotgun, which
nobody's planning on trying to ban, or not very few people are.
Right. That's one that's commonly touted by Democratic politicians. For instance, Tim Walz in Minnesota, or Joe Biden himself has talked about owning shotguns. Pump action shotguns are extremely popular, and they require you to manually pump the gun in order to extract rounds and load new rounds, where semi-automatic will extract the spent round and load the new round on its own, even though you need to pull the trigger for every shot. So a pump action is kind of adds another step to the process of firing the gun. But even with those, you've seen the same pump actions used in mass shootings as well, including this most recent one. The shooter here also used a pump action shotgun in addition to that semi-automatic rifle, and then they also used some sort of pistol. It appears maybe a semi-automatic pistol. So yeah, you certainly wouldn't stop all mass shootings, because you can just look at ones that have occurred and see that not all of them use AR-15s, for instance. A lot of the high-profile ones have, but actually, if there's a Washington Post review of this a couple of years ago, that handguns, semi-automatic handguns, are the most common firearms used in mass shootings where 4 or more people are killed in a single public incident that's not, related to crime, which is what most people have in their head as an idea of what a mass shooting is.
Mhm. So when we have that debate, it's really a debate about how to reduce the number of deaths in a mass shooting. It's not really a debate about a legislation that really would end or would even significantly reduce mass shootings total.
Well, certainly proponents will argue that it would
Yeah.
significantly reduce them. We had an assault weapons ban in the federal level in the 90s, right, from 94 to 2004. And, there's a debate over how effective that was. Obviously, Columbine happened in 1998 during the assault weapons ban with guns that weren't impacted by it. So it certainly wouldn't. I think it's objectively true that it wouldn't prevent all mass shootings because it didn't prevent all of them when we had a nationwide assault weapons ban. But yeah, the debate is over how much it would impact.
Now, outside of legislation, the thing that I've heard that's probably even more important than legislation is the way that we culturally talk about mass shootings, isn't that right? Or the way the media presents mass shootings. What have you learned about that? Like, what are some things that we can do different to contribute to like reducing mass shootings at a cultural level?
Yeah, that's a good question too. I mean, because there is a lot of discussion around what's the best way to cover mass shootings to prevent copycatting, essentially, which as we discussed earlier, is a common feature of a lot of mass shootings, including this mass shooting. This shooter wrote the names of other mass shooters on their guns as well, as all these offensive messages, anti-religious, anti-Jewish, just all kind of anti-Trump, all kinds of sort of trying to offend everybody. It seemed like with what they were writing on their guns, which is also another thing that other shooters have done before, write messages on their weapons. And so, there's some discussion around fame seeking and whether making the shooter famous is a good idea, or what the most responsible way of covering this is. And I think those are serious discussions, and I think they relate back to, again, how we cover suicides as news media, because there was some very good research a while back on celebrity suicides and the way that their coverage could have an impact on the general suicide rate in an area where a celebrity had taken their own life. And there were suggestions for how to responsibly cover these incidents, not, because obviously you don't want to get into an area where you're trying to censor news and not, just completely black out all discussion of these of newsworthy topics. But the idea with suicide coverage was that you could avoid certain things, like describing, for instance, the method of suicide. There's a number of ground rules that most publications follow, and it was shown to have had an effect on reducing the spike in suicides that traditionally comes after a well-known person takes their own life. So certainly, I think there's something to be said about, on the news media side, for how we cover these things and trying to develop best practice. I don't think that there really isn't. There's been some effort to not name the shooters as often, or show their pictures as often, and I think I support that personally, but I don't know how much of an impact it has, or if it's had a measurable impact. But I would be, I certainly think it would be a good idea for the industry to develop better standards on best practices for reporting on mass shootings to try and avoid that contagion effect. Although, from the Violence Project's, all the research I've read on this, from Violence Project to Professor Fox, who runs the USA Today Associated Press mass shooting database, to me it feels like this is something culturally beyond news media in particular, and more into media generally. Like the reason, if I say that person seems like a school shooter to me, that we all know what they're talking about,
Yeah.
We all know what I'm saying there, and everyone can recognize that trope of what a school shooter is. That comes from, broader media stereotyping that exists in our society, and I think that has a bigger impact than the person being named or their picture being shown after a mass shooting. Like the fact that everybody, including people in this mental health spiral, recognize what a school shooter looks like, or what kind of traits they have, and what they are not. Obviously, society is not encouraging people to do this, but they are expecting that somebody who fits this mold is going to carry out a horrible attack and murder a bunch of people, right? That's the societal expectation of a school shooter, and the fact that we have that trope very clearly developed now and it shows up all the time in TV and movies and all kinds of places. I think that's a bigger issue, because like if somebody sees themselves in that trope, well, then they have it in their mind that what are you supposed to do? Well, when you get to this point, you're supposed to go out and kill a bunch of people. That I think is a bigger issue than news media naming or showing pictures. While even though that I think plays a role as well.
I wonder if there's anything that we could learn from, because I know in the 1970s there was a huge contagion of serial killers.
Right.
Yeah,
that's one thing that gives me hope, is that
mm-hmm.
we don't have that as much now.
Mm-hmm.
Although that's one of the things that I worry about when you see things like the Dahmer Netflix show that kind
mm-hmm.
of sort of
glorifies
it in a certain way, and certainly draws attention back to it as this is what this kind of person does.
Mm-hmm.
It's not so much that you're saying they should do this, but it's the societal expectation that this kind of person exists and this is what they do. And so if you see yourself, you identify with that person, your thought is, well, this is what I'm supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you know it's wrong and bad, which again, this shooter exhibited those signs as well. Like they left the apologies and said, sorry to their family and loved ones or whatever about carrying out this attack. But, and it's not to say that there's no responsibility on the shooter's part here either. They get into this kind of state where they feel for all kinds of different reasons. Often they'll have different reasons for why they feel society has wronged them, but they all get into the spiral of self-hatred and self-pity that leads to lashing out in this way.
Since we are on a bit of a time crunch, Stephen, I did want to get to the question we originally invited you on here for. President Trump's DC crime crackdown. The statistics show that crime has been down in DC since it began, which I guess shouldn't be all that surprising. There are more law enforcement officers on the street, and they're pretty visible, even in low crime areas in DC. From the beginning of this thing, as you pointed out online, I saw the administration has been touting gun seizures as proof of the effectiveness of what they're doing. Do you see that as problematic? And what sort of constitutional concerns have there, if any, been with these seizures?
Yeah, I guess 2 points there. One, we have seen statistics that show that crime is down year over year if you look at this point, but that was already the case before the federal takeover. DC's crime rate was already dropping significantly. Not that it was solved by any means, right? But it was already on a downward trend, and has really, the murder rate, for instance, has been on a significant decline over the last several years, record pace actually, and to the point where we expect, and we covered this on my podcast, Weekly Reload podcast with Jeff Asher, who's a crime data analyst, that we actually expect that the murder rate may hit record low this year. And that was already the expectation well before any of this happened. Sort of certainly undercuts the justification for why these sorts of tactics are necessary. And deploying, for instance, in the gun rights advocates. I mean, but honestly, both sides don't like this very much, from what I've seen. But the gun rights activists don't love that ATF agents, for instance, are doing like neighborhood patrols as part of this, because they're highly skeptical of the ATF to begin with. And then, yes, the gun seizures has been a very big highlight for the administration in all this. They're still touting it. The Attorney General Pam Bondi gave the updated figure today, and they're touting that as one of their key metrics for how successful they think this takeover has been. But of course, one of the problems some of the backlash we've seen from gun rights activists centers around those seizures, because DC has some of the strictest gun laws in the country. And so some of these seizures, it's not clear how many because the White House won't tell us, and the Metropolitan Police Department won't say, but some of these seizures at least are for standalone possession crimes based on DC's strict gun laws, because DC requires, unlike most states, that you have your guns registered in order to possess them. And also you have to get a concealed carry license to legally carry in DC, and the process for doing that, while the administration, while gun rights advocates give some credit to the administration for reducing wait times involved with the permitting process in DC, it is still one of the most onerous processes to get a permit out there. And so many of these seizures have also been for just carrying without a permit, which arresting people and seizing their guns over the fact that they're not registered or that they don't have a permit to carry, with those being the only charges, that's something that we've seen the Firearms Policy Coalition, the Gun Owners of America, the National Association for Gun Rights, the Liberal Gun Club, and a lot of individual gun rights activists complain about, because they think those laws are unconstitutional. So they see the administration bragging about gun seizures that they, based on crimes they don't think should be crimes, basically. And so there's been some gun backlash on this front. And, in addition to, concerns about the overall tactics, like the deployment of the ATF and the National Guard, but not everybody has spoken out, of course. So I don't want to see, it's not the entire gun rights movement upset about this. The NRA, for instance, has not said anything about any of these gun seizures or the ATF's presence or the National Guard, outside of sort of initially praising the Trump administration for doing this, because they blame the DC officials for letting crime get out of hand in the first place. That's the NRA's position on this, at least so far. But yes, it has started to create, I think, a bit of a split, both between Trump and the gun rights community, which has been a pretty key voting bloc for Republicans and the president. And then also within the gun rights movement itself, which has always had a bit of a tension between your sort of people who will wave the thin blue line flag, your law and order types, and your Gadsden flag, don't tread on me, civil libertarians.
Well, Stephen, we really appreciate you coming on the Reagan Caucus podcast. This has been very informative. I'd recommend that everybody check out thereload.com. It's a great source of information. You're a great source of information, Stephen, and we'd love to have you back on sometime if it's something you're interested in.
Absolutely. I appreciate you guys having me.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you again, and also thanks everybody for tuning in. If you watch today's episode on YouTube, as always, make sure you like the video and subscribe to our channel. If you're listening to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or some other audio platform, please like and subscribe as well. And we will see you all next time on the Reagan Caucus podcast.